Hello students and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be learning about tackling the prose prompt. So obviously the first thing that you're going to encounter is the actual prompt itself. Now you have to analyze that just as much as you do the passage. So as you see here, this is an actual AP Literature prompt that was given a number of years ago. Read the following passage from Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel, The House of Seven Gables, then write a careful analysis of how the narrator reveals the character of Judge Pyncheon. You may emphasize whichever devices, like tone, selection of details, syntax, point of view, you find most significant. So when I read this, I like to pick out the verbs first. What is it actually telling me to do? So there's ultimately two facets to this prompt. It's asking me to write a careful analysis, and then number two is I have to emphasize a specific device or devices that I find most significant. So those are two ideas that the College Board wants me to focus on here. But if we move on, then I want to focus in not just on the verbs, but also the whats. So some of the nouns and the other parts of the sentences here in the prompt. So I also know that I'm not just writing a careful analysis. Specifically, I'm writing a careful analysis on how the narrator reveals the character of Judge Pyncheon. So I'll repeat, how the narrator reveals the character of Judge Pyncheon. How does he show us who this character is? And then I'm not just emphasizing any devices. Specifically, it could be tone, it could be the selection of detail, it could be syntax and point of view. Now, some of these are difficult to write about. Tone, usually students are okay with, so that's usually a safe bet. But selection of detail can be so broad to where when you're picking out details, you could fall into plot summary. So beware of that. I personally would never really pick that to write about unless it's really in my face or I'm in a pinch and I don't know what else to write about. Pyncheon, funny. And then also syntax is pretty difficult to write about as well unless you're comfortable with it. But point of view and tone are usually up students' alleys. And so that's really the prompt. I'm writing an analysis on the character of Judge Pyncheon and picking out specific devices that show me this. What does the analysis of this character tell us about the meaning of the work as a whole? Because that's really what they want us to focus on. In every single one of these prompts, they want us to think big picture, larger ideas. Yes, it's great to analyze Judge Pyncheon. It's great to analyze the characterization of him. You're supposed to. But it also is going to want us to say what the big so what is. Who cares who he is? What is this saying about the meaning of the work? And so as you see here, here's the actual passage. So go ahead and pause the video if you'd like and stop and read this for yourself. Get some ideas. Figure out what you think the passage is talking about. You could also find this on Google. If you just Google Judge Pyncheon passage, it'll probably come up. So now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go through and read this passage and annotate it the way that I would as I read. And I'm going to pay attention to a few things with knowing that I'm specifically looking for who this Judge Pyncheon is, but not just what the text is telling me, but what I can infer, reading between the lines in order to come up with an idea of what this passage might be about. To apply this train of remarks somewhat more closely to Judge Pyncheon. So what's interesting here is syntactically, you do have some punctuation that's being focused on there with the exclamation point. So it is starting us off of something seems remarkable. To apply this train of remarks somewhat more closely to Judge Pyncheon. So the narrator wants to know more about him. We might say, without in the least imputing crime to a personage of his eminent respectability. So older language, difficult to get through, but ultimately the imputing a crime to somebody that's eminent respectability. So it's saying that this narrator doesn't want to give a crime or speak ill of a person who's so respectable. So it definitely seems like Judge Pyncheon has some type of respect here, but the narrator is careful to not want to speak ill of him. We don't know why yet. That there was enough of splendid rubbish in his life to cover up and paralyze a more active and subtle conscience than the judge was ever troubled with. So what's interesting there is splendid rubbish really pops out to me because that's oxymoronic, right? Splendid rubbish. That's like saying beautiful trash. So there was enough of beautiful trash in his life to cover up and paralyze a more active and subtle conscience than the judge was ever troubled with. So it seems like the judge isn't troubled with much because of some type of splendid rubbish. Now, that's telling me that there's something weird about this judge. Maybe he's a good guy but is stupid. We don't know yet. The purity of his judicial character. So again, he is Judge Pyncheon, so it's saying that he's pure. While on the bench, so he's supposed to be just. The faithfulness, another adjective there. When you're dealing with characterization, if the narrator's giving you adjectives, go for it. It's spoon feeding you. Of his public service and subsequent capacities, his devotedness to his party, so politics, and the rigid consistency, with which he adhered to its principles, or at all events kept pace with its organized movements. So that's a lot of good things. This guy seems like a very good guy. So I'm going to put a smiley face there because he seems like a perfect guy. He's pure, he's faithful, he's devoted, he has a rigid consistency, and adhered to all the party principles. Then it goes on, his remarkable zeal, so that's great stuff too, as president of a Bible society. I mean, come on, this guy seems awesome. He's faithful, he's pure, he's devoted, he has consistency, he has zeal. He's a president of a Bible society. So not only is he a judge, but he's also president of a Bible society. His unimpeachable integrity. I mean, that's amazing. As treasurer, person who handles money, of a widows and orphans fund. I mean, right now this is all just a list. And notice there's a lot of commas, there's some semicolons, so syntactically, dealing with syntax, the narrator is just listing a bunch of stuff right here. It's actually kind of boring, but what's interesting is he's painting this picture like this judge is amazing, but remember what he said at the beginning. He said all this is splendid rubbish, apparently. He was setting us up. So I don't know why this is splendid rubbish, though, because he's president of a Bible society, he's a judge, and he has unimpeachable. You can't knock him as a treasurer, a person who handles the money of a widows and orphans fund. His benefits to horticulture, I believe that has to do with plants, by producing two much esteemed varieties of the pear, and to agriculture through the agency of the famous Pyncheon bull. So that right there is very confusing to me because it seems out of place. Yes, it's within this list of great things, but it just mentions some really heavy-duty stuff. Being a judge, president of a Bible society, treasurer of a widows and orphans funds. It's like things to put on a college resume here. Give this guy a Nobel Prize. But then it goes from those things of being very philanthropic to he actually makes plants. He made a variety of a pear, and he did something else as well with a Pyncheon bull. I don't know if that's the type of flower that he created named after him. Seems odd, right? One of these things is not like the other. On the one hand, you have president of a Bible society and widows and orphans funds treasurer, and then I created a pear. Very strange. So I'm going to come back to that because I'm not quite sure what it means yet. The cleanliness of his moral deportment for a great many years, the severity with which he had frowned upon and finally cast off an expensive and dissipated son. So what's interesting there is it's very Puritan-like. You know, this guy seems great. He has cleanliness of moral deportment, severity with which he had frowned upon. So this is referring to his son, and he's saying that the son is an expensive son, and he finally cast off his son. So this dude is intense if he really disapproved of his son that much to where he casts him off. Delaying forgiveness until within the final quarter of an hour of the young man's life. So his son is dying. Like, that's not good. And he didn't forgive his son for something until an hour before he died. So right away, I'm thinking, in terms of Puritan type of living, on the one hand, this guy seems great, and he's president. He's doing a lot, right? He has a lot of charitable service, but within his own home, he can't forgive his son. So that seems like something meaningful there. That seems like a conflict. You always want to find a conflict within the story, and here it's like a list of great stuff, but then embedded in here is this idea that he can't forgive his son, which is pretty important. So definitely going to star that. His prayers at morning and eventide and graces at mealtime, his efforts in furtherance of the temperance cause, that's not drinking, his confining himself since the last attack of the gout to 5 diurnal glasses of old sherry. So the only reason why he did drink was because he had gout, a sickness. The snowy whiteness of his linen, the polish of his boots. That's very military-like, where everything's in order. The handsomeness of his gold-headed cane. I don't know why. That seems weird. That he would have a gold-headed cane. That seems weird. I don't know if that's trying to put in there and say that maybe he is a little vain, maybe? I'm not sure. The square and roomy fashion of his coat and the fineness of its material. So he's wearing a nice coat, too. And what's interesting is it said that his son was expensive. I'm wondering if he gets that from the dad here. And in general, the studied propriety of his dress and equipment. The scrupulousness with which he paid public notice in the street by a bow. Scrupulousness is like being very deliberate. And he's paying public notice by doing what? By a bow, lifting of the hat, a nod. So he seems to be very polite to all and sundry his acquaintances, rich or poor. The smile of broad benevolence wherewith he made it a point to gladden the whole world. What room could possibly be found for darker traits in a portrait made up of lineaments like these? So that seems to be a little bit of commentary mixed in with this. So it's also referring to his dress. So how could you have any room for any bad stuff to say about him when he wears such nice clothes? That's what it seems to be saying. But I'm getting a sense that even though he's all great, there is something dark in his life. It could be with his son and not forgiving him, because it does mention that he delayed forgiveness, and yet when he's out in the street, he's bowing to people, he's smiling at people, he's putting on a face, it almost seems. This proper face was what he beheld in the looking glass. So now it's saying that he's looking in a mirror, and in terms of literature, that's always super important, so I'm going to super circle that, even though I block off stuff, because looking in a mirror is often symbolic of like finding out what's wrong with you. This admirably arranged life was what he was conscious of in the progress of every day. Then, might not he claim to be its result and sum, and to say to himself in the community, "Behold, Judge Pyncheon there"? And allowing that many, many years ago, in his early and reckless youth, he had committed some one wrong act, or even now, the inevitable force of circumstances should occasionally make him do one questionable deed among 1,000 praiseworthy, or at least blameless ones, would you characterize the judge by that one necessary deed and that half-forgotten act, and let it overshadow the fair aspect of a lifetime? So there's some more explanation points too. Now what's interesting, there is a shift in this passage. The first half, it's almost all listing after the introduction, where he's saying splendid rubbish, and then he lists all these things. And now here in this passage, it seems to be more commentary. So he's done with the list, and he's getting more philosophical. And he's saying, like, what if he had committed one wrong act in his youth when he was reckless? Would that make him a bad guy? Or even now, what if he did one questionable deed, but he did 1,000 praiseworthy? Would you characterize him by that one bad deed, if it was even necessary, and let it overshadow the fair aspect of a lifetime? So I don't know if the narrator's speaking directly to somebody, that's unclear, but it is an interesting question. Because he's kind of asking, if this guy is so great and he does all these things, but he did one wrong thing, one thing that's questionable, would you categorize him by that one questionable deed? Or would you categorize him by the 1,000 good ones? It's almost like asking the essential question, how much good do you have to do in order to be a good person? And how much bad do you have to do in order to be a bad person? So very interesting. What is there so ponderous and evil that a thumb's bigness of it should outweigh the mass of things not evil, which were heaped into the other scale? This scale, which is, it's great that he's bringing up scale because he is a judge, right? So the narrator's doing a little play on words there. This is a judge, and now he's bringing up the scale of right and wrong. and balance system is a favorite one with people of Judge Pyncheon's brotherhood. A hard, cold man, thus unfortunately situated, seldom or never looking inward, and resolutely taking his idea of himself from what purports to be his image, as reflected in the mirror of public opinion. So there's another mirror being mentioned, but this time it's the mirror of public opinion. What do people see and think about him? Can scarcely arrive at true self-knowledge except through loss of property and reputation. Sickness will not always help him to it, not always the death hour. So I would definitely have to figure out, in this ending portion here, what is the narrator really trying to say? What is the narrator trying to tell us here when it's mentioning that a hard, cold man like Judge Pyncheon is unfortunately situated? He never really looks inward, and he only gets his idea of himself from what appears to be his image, from other people. And if you do that, you could never really arrive at true knowledge of yourself unless you lose something near and dear to you. Not even sickness. So it's only like if you lose property and reputation. So I think that's actually what this narrator and what this author is trying to get us at, is arriving at self-knowledge unless you lose property and reputation, which is telling us that Judge Pyncheon probably very much idolizes his property and his reputation. I mean, because it did mention his gold-headed cane, it mentioned his coats, everything's in order. He really likes being the face of things, the president of the Bible Society, the treasurer of the Widows and Orphans Fund. Now, those are all great things, but you have to ask, why is he doing it? Well, the narrator seems to be suggesting that a lot of that stuff is splendid rubbish, meaning, yeah, it's a good thing, but he's wondering if that's all the judge seems to care about. Is the judge primarily concerned with his reputation? And there is evidence for that back in the text. It's talking about how he goes out and he's bowing and he's very political and polite to people. So it definitely does seem like he wants people to see him a certain way. I'm still going back to the fact that he won't even forgive his son until the last hour before his son dies. So I wonder if that's the bad negative thing that was talked about over around lines 40 to 45. But regardless, I think we have a good picture of Judge Pyncheon. And so in terms of going back to the prompt, we have to figure out what Judge Pyncheon is referring to and who he is as a person, right? What can we infer about his characterization? Well, I can infer that he really loves his status. He loves helping people, but probably more so out of selfish reasons. It seems like he's more concerned with getting his name on things and being the head of stuff than just being a lowly servant. And it seems like this passage is leading us to the conclusion that you can never really get self-knowledge of who you are unless you drop the act, unless you get rid of some property and you don't care about your reputation, right? Until you're the lowest of the low is when you can truly look in a mirror and see who you really are. Otherwise, you'll be too clouded by what other people think of you or too clouded by what your stuff says you are.